Hello and welcome to this webinar to discuss the OECD report just published today entitled Students, Computers and Learning, Making the Connection. The report is based on results from the PISA 2012 assessment of reading, mathematics and science. Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD's Directorate for Education and Skills, and Francesco Avisati, Education Analyst and author of the report, will first present the findings of the study, and then we'll be happy to answer your questions. Please feel free to send your questions via the chat function to me, Marilyn Acheron. Andreas, would you like to begin?
Thanks so much for your interest in this report. I must say this report has been long overdue. We know that technology is transforming every aspect of our work and life, and we've got to see how well are we doing in integrating technologies effectively in teaching and learning. You might have seen this cover of The Economist telling us that the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, and are also easy to automate, digitize, and outsource. There's been huge changes on our labor markets. Now, robots are taking over whole factories, and it's not just factories alone. You might have seen the Google autonomous vehicle, which has been running for 1 million kilometers without major accidents and only occasional human intervention. What is that going to do to millions of lorry drivers, taxi drivers, train drivers? There's lots of jobs that are at stake these days. Technology is really the key to success in many ways. Think about augmented reality. We're now able to bring the world's most advanced knowledge in real time into everything that we are doing. And that means the world no longer rewards us just for what we know, what we're teaching in schools. Google knows everything these days. The world rewards us for what we can do with what we know. That's the main differentiator. So again, and there's a lot more to come. I don't want to go through all of this. So this is why we have paid attention to this in our latest PISA assessment in the year 2012. First of all, looking at what students know and how well they can actually navigate through this digital world. So that's sort of a scale of student performance in digital reading, where they had to navigate through information, find their way through quite complex websites, the kind of skills that you actually need today to access, manage, integrate, and evaluate digital information. We found out that Singapore was coming out on top. In fact, many of the East Asian education systems doing really well. They had the most technology-savvy students. And I'm highlighting this here because later on you're going to see these countries have often actually been quite cautious in integrating technology in the classrooms. And where they do, they typically start out with the teachers, connecting teachers, connecting classrooms, spreading, sharing practices, sharing experience. But when it comes to, student use of technology, quite moderate users of technology. But anyway, that's the scale. Those are the kind of skills that we could be seeing in this test on digital literacy carried out in the 32 countries you see on the map, 60,000 students being tested. So it's the largest ever survey on the outcomes, on the learning outcomes in the digital world that we have. Now, one question you might ask yourself, are we getting the same results that we would be getting on a normal test, when we test students to read stuff on text format, printed text? And the answer is in many countries, yes, but in some countries, in fact, performance is quite different. If you look to Singapore, students are ahead by 30 points in digital reading compared with print reading. And it's interesting, Singaporean students did already do well on traditional reading, but they're doing even better on digital reading. Korea, Japan, Hong Kong as well. United States is an interesting example. They only do so-so in print reading, but on the average, but they are slightly above the average when it comes to digital reading. And there are countries where students struggle. You look to Poland, Hungary, the United Arab Emirates, where you can actually see students having much greater difficulty, navigating through digital information than through linear text in a printed book. So the results are similar, but they're not the same. I think that's very, very important to know. So why is that? We ask ourselves, what makes students successful on this digital test? And the answer is, the more strategically they click through those kinds of web pages, figuring out, what is the problem at hand, basically working carefully through the text rather than clicking at random, the better they did on the assessment. And again, no surprise, you find Singapore, again, ahead of other countries. You can look at this in a bit more fine-grained ways. Now, in every country, there's a proportion of students you basically just clicking around at random. You can't see any kind of strategy in the results. Some who don't even try, where we could not measure any browsing activity. Then you have a large share of students where you could see some strategy, but there were still sort of as many missteps than task-relevant steps. But then you have a share of students where you can really see they're highly focused. Now they know what they want to do and they get there progressively. If you look to Singapore, that's almost half of the students, Korea 40%. So it's actually a significant share in some countries. But you look to Brazil or Colombia, it's just 1 in 10 students where you can say, well, they actually know what they're doing when they use digital information. So those are important drivers, and you can actually summarize this in here. Print reading, your capacity to master the conceptual skills of reading, whether on print or on digital text, that's still the major determinant of success. And that's also showing you why it is so important that students have the fundamentals. That digital technology cannot replace those fundamentals. 80% of the variation on the digital test is predicted by a student's capacity to read. Then you have about 4% that explained by the quantity of navigation steps, how many clicks people did. 10% is explained by what I just showed you, the quality of navigation. And then last but not least, about 5% that we just don't know. So again, there is a relationship, but it's not uniform. And you can actually see that again here on where you see the relationship in digital and print reading. The index of task-oriented browsing is an important predictor of student performance on the digital test. So it's not rocket science. We actually understand quite well why some students do better on the digital test than they do on a print test. How does it look in mathematics? We did the same thing in mathematics, and actually the order of countries is broadly similar. You have Shanghai in China doing better in math and in reading. But, broadly, the countries come out in quite similar ways on both of those assessments. And once again, you can look at their relative performance. Also here, you have some countries who are relatively speaking stronger in the digital medium than on the print math test. They're here on the left side of the chart, and then some countries that struggle more. France, Chile, Ireland, Poland are countries where students had a harder time working on a more kind of dynamic mathematics test in a digital environment than on the kind of school tests they were used to. Well, that's what students know, what they can do. These are the results. Of course, the interesting question is, where do those results come from? How do students actually use computers? The first thing we looked at is what access do they have to computers at home? And here you can see basically in most countries of the industrial world, there's a computer in the student's home. And in fact, in a fair share of countries' homes, there are 3 or more computers. So basically, you can almost talk about personalized access to computers in those countries. And there have been important changes. You can see that here in the variant of the chart. In the last 3 years, between 2009 and 2012, you could see actually many households catching up with this, moving towards 3 or more computers. And again, if you imagine today we're in the year 2015, probably all those numbers are still better. So access to computers at home is looking good and actually better as we speak. But is that access spread similarly across social and economic groups? Is digital technology helping to bridge the divide between privileged and less privileged students? Well, we looked into that. You can see the results here on that screen. This shows you the access to the internet at home and student socioeconomic status. What you do see is that in most countries, to the left side, basically, access is pretty much universal. Students from all social groups have access to the internet now, but if you look to the right part of the chart, there are countries with significant socioeconomic disparities. And you look to Vietnam, you look to Indonesia, Mexico, but even the United States. You could say that about 20% of the students from the bottom quarter on the socioeconomic spectrum don't have access to the internet. So social disparities are still of a concern in a fair number of countries. Sort of bridging the social divide is still a challenge in many, but not all countries. You look at Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Hong Kong, the Netherlands, Norway, Switzerland, Sweden, and so on. There, that is no longer an issue. Early exposure. When do students first see a computer? We looked at the percentage of students who used a computer when they were 6 years or younger by social group. And again, you can see this is an area where in almost all countries, social background matters. Now, if you look to the most privileged students marked here in green, you can see a lot of them had a computer when they were 6 years or younger, whereas in the bottom quarter, that's not very common. So again, social disparities seem to play an important role that we need to take into account. Gender is a factor too. In several countries, actually, the gap is quite significant. When you look at the young children who had access to computers, boys seem to be more prevalent in a fair number of countries. So there is not just a socioeconomic gap, there's also a gender gap in access to a technology. One question we were particularly interested in is, where do schools make a real difference? So here you see the percentage of students who have access to the internet at school, but not at home. So those are the children where sort of school is a particularly important environment in introducing them to technology. And you can see countries like Mexico, Turkey, Jordan, Costa Rica, Chile, Uruguay, Greece coming out really, really importantly. But when you look at the socioeconomic disadvantaged students marked here by the gray diamond, that's actually in an even larger number of countries the case. So once again, school does play an important role in introducing young people to technology. How much time do students spend online? It's one thing to have a computer, it's another thing, how intensive it is being utilized. So we wanted to look at that as well. And here you can see the time that students spend online in school or out of school during weekdays, out of the school. So that's basically what they do at home or elsewhere. And you can see that's a fair chunk of time. It's basically an hour in a fair number of countries, 2 hours in a fair number of countries. No? Somewhat between an hour and 2 hours in most countries. You add to this the time students spend at school on the internet, and look at Australia here. No? That is actually a big chunk of time. Australia seems to be the most heavy technology user at school. And then during weekdays, obviously, students have less schoolwork. Technology is becoming a bigger factor on this. So we're talking here roughly about 2 hours of time. That's an important chunk of students' learning time or students' playing time. We want to know, how does it actually feed into better learning? So a fair chunk of time going into this. Doing too much of this can detract from other objectives, and we actually see that reflected in the chart here. You can see students that actually spend a lot of time on the internet, something like more than 6 hours, very often feel very lonely at school. And in fact, there is a relationship between those variables, particularly at the high end of the spectrum. So it actually highlights that, extreme internet user students who put a lot of time into this are often quite isolated and feel isolated. We don't know what the nature of that relationship is and in what direction the causal relationship goes, but it is important to note that, high chunks of time really bear some risks in this. Now, of course, availability of technology is one thing. What we were most interested in is how do we use it in teaching and learning. So we studied this as well. Here you have, as a first thing, of course, importantly, the number of students per school computer. And you look at this chart, and in most countries in the industrialized world, you can really say that, there's a fair number of computers available. You have, roughly between 4 and 5 students per computer. In a few countries it's more, in some countries a lot more, but there are also countries like Australia, New Zealand, where you get close to sort of a one, or United Kingdom, Macau, China, where you get close to a 1-to-1 ratio. So again, schools seem to have sufficient numbers of computers at their disposal. How are they being utilized? You can see that here on the chart. Browsing the internet for schoolwork is the most dominant activity. You can see roughly, 40% of students saying they do that at least once a week. Very common in Australia, over 80% of students saying so. Less common in Shanghai, just 1 in 10. Using school computers for group work and communication with other students, that was also quite common. Doing individual homework on a school computer, not so common in Japan, but again, very important activity in Australia. Using email at school, and so on. So you can see actually there's a pattern of how computers are used. That pattern varies a bit across countries, but in a fair number of countries, it's a fairly typical pattern that you can see here represented in the average. We try to summarize all of that information to get sort of some sense of the intensity of use of technology at school. And this measure is quite important, but because I'm going to come back to this in some other slides when I talk about the relationship to outcomes. You look to Denmark, Norway, Australia, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic on this chart, and you can actually see, they are heavy users of technology at school. On the other side of the spectrum, you see Korea, Japan, Shanghai, where actually technology isn't used very heavily by students. It's still available often, but sort of its use is quite moderate in school. So this is a summary measure of the frequency and intensity and the diversity of technology use at school. It's a quite important summary. That brings me to perhaps the most interesting and most intriguing and important question. What do we actually learn about the impact of technology use on learning outcomes? Have a look at this chart. It's actually quite puzzling. That perhaps was one of the biggest surprises for us. We looked at the number of computers per student, the kind of information that I presented to you before, but we adjusted it for per capita GDP to get some fairness in the wealth of countries into this picture. And that's what you see on the horizontal axis. And then on the vertical axis, I show you the improvement or decline in student learning outcomes, in this case in mathematics. The higher you are on this chart, the more improvement have we seen in learning outcomes over the period 2003-2012. The lower you are, the more have learning outcomes declined. And you look at this relationship, and you actually see that where countries are introducing more computers per student, we actually see the decline in learning outcomes. Australia, New Zealand, Czech Republic. On the other side of the spectrum, where they have fewer computers, Turkey, Tunisia, Brazil, Mexico, we have seen steep rises in learning outcomes. So that is a real puzzle. One thing is clear that, just putting technology in schools, in a classroom, investing in technology has certainly not been associated with improvements in learning outcomes. It's very, very hard to read anything into those charts. No? There could be many, many reasons explaining this kind of country patterns. But the one thing that you can sort of read out of this with certainty, that investment in technology is certainly not an automatic driver of improvements in learning outcomes. That's a pretty aggregate picture. It gets a lot more interesting when we look at this at the level of individual students. And that's what you see here. On the horizontal axis, I again have our index of the intensity of ICT use at school. And if you are basically above 0 on that index, your students would be using email at school at least once a month. They would browse the internet for schoolwork at least once a week, and they practice at least once a month. If you're further along on the index, above 1, you would chat or email at least once a week. At school, you would browse the internet for school almost every day, and you would practice at least weekly. Right? So basically, that is our summary index. And on the vertical axis of the chart, I show you the PISA performance, in this case, in digital reading. So these are the digital literacy skills that students are able to demonstrate in the test? Well, you know, and if technology, if the intensity of ICT use would be relating to the digital savviness skills of students, you'd see sort of a line growing up on this chart. But in fact, when you look at the relationship, it looks like that. And that was, again, a surprise for us. What this data show is if you don't use a lot of technology at school, you know, you don't do so well on this kind of test, which is intuitive. You know, students who have not much exposure to technology won't do as well on a technology-based test. But what you also see is that if you use technology a lot, very frequently, you do even worse. The optimal figure lies actually at a quite low level of technology use. Why do I say low level? Because in fact the OECD average is about here. It's already on the downward sloping side of this. So what these data tell us, again, you know, it's very hard to read much into those kinds of summary pictures, but what these data tell us that in our school systems we are already beyond the point in technology use and yields optimal learning outcomes. Many of the countries, many of the schools that are actually showing superior learning outcomes seem to be actually more moderate in the technology use. With print reading, the picture is quite similar. So there's not that much differences in the nature of the assessment that we have. So that's, again, you know, a very sobering picture, because we all know, you know, technology is there to stay. Technology is a huge power to transform learning environments, to make learning more engaging, lots of things. But we don't seem to be doing sufficiently well in integrating that technology so that it leads to continually rising learning outcomes. Students end up, you know, cutting and pasting information from Google to prefabricated questions, then that's unlikely to make them smarter. So those things are very, very important issues for us to digest. We've been looking into that in a bit more detail. First of all, we have looked at, you know, performance in digital reading by different types of competencies. Browsing the internet, for example. You can see students who do that once or twice a month or once or twice a week actually did best on the digital test. Students doing it less or students doing it more did worse. That's quite similar to the picture that you saw before. When we look at email at school, there we see actually just a downward slope. The less students do that, the more students do that, the less they perform on the digital test. The same for chatting, the same for practicing and drilling. We've also studied this by the quality of navigation, you know, the kind of things that I showed you, clicking strategically, thinking through what navigation strategies do I need to use. And again, you can see that for browsing the internet, that is moderately good for you, but almost any other use shows a negative relationship. Now, whatever the causal nature, these might be different students, you know, students who basically chat a lot and use email at school, might be students not doing so well on this kind of assessment. It's very, very hard to discern from this data. This is just a cross-sectional relationship, but still, I think it tells a very, very important story. So this is just a bit more detail behind the picture that you saw before. What about mathematics? Actually, it is even stronger pronounced. Basically, you can see there's just a downward slope. The more intensive computers are used in mathematics lessons, the less well do school systems come out and students come out on the PISA assessment. The highest score is pretty much at the low end of intensity of computer use. So again, very sobering for us. The OECD average is around here. On a more positive note, you know, one thing that we found really intriguing is we ask students a lot of questions about their learning environment and the instructional practices they perceive. And there you can actually see students who use computers talk more about teachers who are structuring the lessons well, which is important. We know that's an important factor of teaching quality. Or they're using more formative assessments, or they are doing more more oriented towards the students, personalizing learning better. Cognitive activation, you know, making sure that students are attentive, that they are curious, that they're engaged in what teachers do. Also, that seemed to be positively related to students' use. Disciplinary climate, we didn't find much of a relation. So I think these kind of patterns give us some angle. You know, there is something in technology. if we deploy it well, if we learn how to use it well, actually it seems to amplify some good teaching practices. Well, once again, I think in summary, you can fairly say that technology can amplify great teaching, but it doesn't replace poor teaching. We had a different survey. That's not PISA, that's our TALES survey, that actually asks students what kind of pedagogies they value. And you can see in virtually all countries, most teachers are very much into 21st century pedagogies. My role as a teacher is to facilitate students' own inquiry. 9 out of 10 teachers around countries tell you that. There's very little variation among countries. Students learn best by finding own solutions to their own problems. So again, most teachers actually have this kind of focus on inquiry-based learning. But when we actually surveyed them on what they do in the classroom, it came out very differently. You saw that there was a lot of technology used in classrooms, but when we asked teachers actually, do your students use ICT for projects or classwork, for more sustained activities, frequently or nearly all lessons? So only about 40% of teachers on average were telling us. So there seems to be a gap between what teachers perceive to be good teaching practice and what they actually do in the classroom. So this is gives you some hint that integrating technology in the classrooms is something that we can do a lot better. We also ask teachers, where do you see your greatest needs of improvement? And teaching students with special needs always comes first. Socioeconomic diversity, other diversity is always a big challenge. But next on the list of teachers come ICT skills for teaching, new technologies in the workplace. So if you want to leverage the potential of new technology, we've got to invest more heavily in the human capacities, the human infrastructure in schools according to these kinds of data. How can we act on this? We think about this in 4 dimensions. The first thing technology actually allows us to, connect educators, give them platforms for collaborative work, collaborative planning, share professional development strategies. And if you look to Shanghai in China, Singapore, they're providing fantastic examples of this. Open up new pedagogical options. Obviously, we can also use technology to connect learners. And we also see a positive relationship with a sense of belonging, student engagement. We can mix students of different ages, different countries, different social backgrounds. It's a fantastic tool, technology, to actually link up students in intelligent ways, to widen pedagogical options, and so on. We can reschedule learning. You can actually see that learning is not a place but an activity. We can connect the home environment and the school environment. We can create virtual environments for students. There's a lot we can actually achieve through technology. And the hardest challenge, obviously, is, how can we actually leverage new pedagogies through technology, inquiry-based learning, authentic learning, more collaborative learning. And I tell you, this is also, when we talk about our PISA assessment itself, a very important goal for us. This year's PISA assessment had a strong focus on collaborative skills, on social skills. That is because those skills are increasingly valued. And it's very hard to develop social skills in a typical classroom environment. But technology is a great tool to actually do better on that. That's the potential. Technology can amplify innovative teaching and expanding access to content. Why should our students learn from a textbook that was printed last year and maybe designed, 5 years ago, if they can have access to the world's most advanced knowledge anywhere around the world? Supporting new pedagogies where teachers become active learners, active participants, inquiry-based pedagogies, collaborative workspaces. I think there's a lot of potential that we can still leverage. I already highlighted, many of the most advanced nations in technology use actually have powerful frameworks for teacher collaboration, knowledge creation, knowledge sharing, where teachers basically develop, share, and enrich teaching material. Technology enables us to make formative assessment a much more powerful tool, provide faster and more granular feedback to students, to parents, to other schools, and so on, and those kinds of things. If you think about the pedagogical aspect in a bit more detail, experiential learning, virtual and remote laboratories are a fantastic tool to give students hands-on experience, project-based and inquiry-based pedagogies, hands-on pedagogies, game development, really good development is in place. At the very same time, I must tell you, few children would probably voluntarily play with a kind of digital software that we put often in our schools these days. So there's a lot of gap between the ideas and principles and what we see happening today. Cooperative learning again, interactive and metacognitive pedagogies. Why I'm putting up such a long list, I just want to highlight that it is absolutely important to get this right. Our data show we're not there yet. Is disappointing. That's very clear from those results, and far away from the returns that we would have expected from the investments that have been made. Probably we overestimate the digital skills among teachers, maybe among students. That's what the data on professional development suggests. There have been a lot of naive policy and implementation strategies, countries rolling out, handing out laptops without actually having any form of capacity and strategy behind that. There's probably still some resistance of teachers and students. We all know that technology that is available isn't always as used as best as it can. And there's certainly a lot of lack of understanding of pedagogy and instructional design. So I think there's a lot to do to improve the impact on learning outcomes. There are some very promising developments, highly interactive, nonlinear courseware based on state-of-the-art instructional design, experimentation, simulation. If you learn mathematics, science, today you can actually play with dimensions, time, space that you couldn't possibly do in a traditional learning environment. But again, the data from this survey show that actually those, particularly simulation in mathematical classrooms, are actually quite rare, and where they happen, they again seem to be often detracting from learning outcomes rather than adding to them. One more broadly derived conclusion from this: you probably have to work harder on making the costs and benefits of technology more symmetric. Everybody likes technology, everybody supports more innovation in learning environments, except for their own children. We live in a world that is actually quite innovation hostile in the field of school education. And the benefits for the winners of technological innovation in classrooms are often insufficient. You can clearly see this from this data. To mobilize really strong enthusiasm and support, the costs are often concentrated, and that's actually why interest groups in education are so powerful. So we've got to have more consistent, coordinated efforts to persuade those who are affected why we need to change, and then particularly also tell, what are the costs of inaction, and what if basically we disconnect the technology-rich world from the learning environment at school. That is already, we know that all from our children, that is a big challenge for them, right? When they ask to switch off anything that has an on-off switch as soon as they enter the schoolroom. Now, there is a lot to lose if we don't get that right. And last but not least, nobody likes change, particularly not in education. So we need to be better at communicating, making a case for change, building support for change. And support comes always with capacity. Investing in capacity development, change management skills, developing better evidence, and feed that evidence back to institutions. In the field of technology, there has been a lot of ideology, a lot of beliefs, blind investment in technology or people rejecting it all around. Now we're starting to build this evidence. For the very first time, we have a robust knowledge base on what students can actually do, but we need to do better, more. We need to get that back to the institutions. Obviously, we've got to have sustainable financing for all of this. And allow me one last point. We strongly believe at the OECD that teachers need to be active agents, not just in the implementation of technological strategies, but actually in the design because they know best what's valuable at the front line. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas. We received several questions during the presentation, and at this point I would also like to bring in Francesco Avisati. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Francesco, for this study, were listening and visual skills and presenting skills also assessed? Another person asked whether 21st century skills were assessed in this study. Could you please speak to that question?
Yeah, you know, digital literacy skills are 21st century skills. Those skills are not everything that students need, but they have a very important kind of 21st century dimension. And in general, the PISA assessment assesses students' thinking skills, you know, the capacity of students to think creatively, to solve novel problems, and all of those things are important in the 21st century. That's not everything. You know, we know about the importance of social and emotional skills, all of that. That's still beyond the scope of PISA. We are only progressively getting into this. But still, you know, when you look at the outcomes that we have measured today, there's a fair bit of what we need to be successful in the 21st century.
Thank you. We have another question. This study, we speak a lot about navigation and students' ability to navigate through and across various texts. And one participant asked us, missteps in navigation, is this never productive? This is kind of a philosophical question. Would either you, Andreas, or Francesco like to answer this?
Yeah, let me start, and I'm sure Francesco will have more ideas on this. You know, when you enter a website, nobody knows where you end up. You know, that's something that requires a certain degree of experimentation. The question here is, you know, is that experimentation strategic? You know, do I basically click in a sort of, do I try and error? Do I keep trying in a systematic way? And that's really the question we're asking ourselves here. I'm not saying that, you know, you should only click on the correct link, but that students have some sense of, you know, what's the goal, where I'm going to get to, and then use their digital skills in a thoughtful rather than a random way. You can see, I mean, what is really nicely when you look at the data in greater detail, the Japanese kids, you know, they think about a problem, they know what they want to solve, and then it takes them quite a while, and then with a few clicks, they got it right. You can see in other countries, you know, students, if the Brazilian students, you know, they click around a lot and they may never get the problem right. So I think having actually a thoughtful strategy there is what is important. Missteps can be very productive because you find out new possibilities.
Francesco, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, so hello. Yeah, we see that, of course, I mean, there's really two ways of getting things wrong in digital reading. One is not even trying to solve the task, remaining stranded almost, remaining at the first page, and that's obviously the biggest mistake you can do. And then the other thing is, when you do a mistake, not being able to correct this mistake once you realize it is a mistake. And that's what we really call the missteps in this study. And we see that the countries that do fall back in the ranking when going from print reading to digital reading, we can basically say for each of them, it's mostly because the students do not have the basic technical skills for some of these countries. They don't know the conventions of the online reading, they don't know where to start navigation, or maybe they're afraid or not motivated to do so. And for other countries, it's much more the second kind of mistake. They get lost in the navigation as soon as they make a mistake, and that's not productive and that's not effective. It's also interesting to see that when we look at, for instance, students' use of technology outside of school by socioeconomic status, we see that those students who have better reading skills, they tend to read more online, and they tend to engage in activities which require this kind of navigation activity, strategic navigation, going through several sources, reading news online. Whereas students who struggle with reading skills, very often they end up using poor digital tools such as chat or social networks, where everything comes to them, rather than them being the actors and the authors, so to speak, of their own text and of their own learning.
Okay, thank you. Another question that came to us, is there any anecdotal data or factors on why math students appear to do better without technology?
You know, I don't think we should get into anecdotal evidence. You know, that's not the philosophy of the study. And I also don't want to say that this is a necessity. You know, there may well be great mathematics lessons that actually use technology in very thoughtful, very creative ways. But what we do see here is that there seem to be more bad than good examples. So we do see that basically the overall intensity of technology use seems to be negatively related to math learning outcomes. It is I must say, for me, that was one of the most surprising findings, because I would have thought that technology is a particularly useful tool to enhance mathematics teaching. And many of the kind of phenomena that we study in mathematics, space, change, relationship, probability, they're actually very hard to imagine, very hard to visualize. Technology enables us to play around with it, to do simulations. So, but again, it doesn't seem to be borne out by the data that we have here.
Thank you. Another question. Could you speak, either Andreas or Francesco, to the importance of social and collaborative skills and the use of technology, given the fact that students who use technology the most seem to feel the most lonely when they're at school?
You know, there is no question of the rising relevance of social skills in our digital world. You know, innovation today is no longer about you having a great idea and implementing it, but innovation really today is about connecting the dots, working with people who are different from you, think differently from you. So the kind of social skills, the capacity to communicate, collaborate, compete, are very, very important. Again, technology is a very powerful lever to develop those skills. Now we can build collaborative learning environments. Now we can assess collaborative skills, as we now do in PISA. So there's great potential here. But, you know, once again, if students are just, using social media in a negative way, we also know, for example, online bullying is a social media phenomenon. So we can use these things for very unproductive uses. And in the past, you were bullied at school, but you got home and you were at peace. Today online bullying follows you anywhere. So again, it's a double-edged sword again. The question is, can we make good use out of the potential to develop collaborative skills that we know are increasingly important?
I would like to bring the focus around a little bit to teachers. What does this study mean for teacher training, both teacher training, and what does it mean? How important are teachers in the idea of whether technology is going to be introduced in classrooms? What should teachers be doing, or what can teachers be doing to improve student learning with computers and to introduce students to computers in general? Either of you.
Yeah, teachers are at the front line. They are basically the ones to deliver learning environments, to shape, create, and design learning environments. They use the technology that students have. So they are absolutely a critical part of the picture. At the very same time, our data show that they express great needs in improving their digital skills. That's what we see from the TALIS data. So I think it's the interface between teaching and learning that is often lacking. And what has clearly happened in many countries is that we have sort of made a very front-loaded approach where we put technology in the classrooms that then didn't work, or didn't work for teachers, where teachers were insufficiently prepared. And this is not just a matter of technical skills. This is really about, pedagogical options. It's about learning environments. It's about democratizing knowledge. If you put a computer in the classroom, if you give students access to knowledge, you fundamentally change the nature of the relationship between teachers and students. Suddenly you no longer hold the monopoly over knowledge. Your students have access to the very same knowledge that you have. So those dynamics change fundamentally, and that requires a very, very different caliber of teachers, a very different approach to teacher training. Another dimension for this is, how do we get good practices out of the classroom to the next teacher, to the next, back into the profession? So also here, I think there is a lot of homework for education systems to do to provide better training, better support, and a more intelligent set of incentive structures for teachers. And once again, but perhaps if I may add here, those education systems with the most technology-savvy students with the best performance on the PISA assessment as well in East Asia, they typically, put the premium on teachers. They get teachers ready, they support teachers, they challenge teachers with the use of technology before they actually start rolling that out to individual students. That's at least what our data here suggests.
And what about for students? What does the study show that would be, what are the basic skills, ICT skills that the study shows that students should be learning at this point by the time they're 15 years old? What are the basic ICT skills that a 15-year-old student should have before he or she leaves compulsory education?
Okay, I'll try to answer this question. So one important thing is that teachers who have technology in their classroom must use it for a specific purpose of developing some sort of learning in the students. And clearly, developing some ICT-related learning seems the most natural use of technology in classroom. Now, we have good examples of including with the PISA test of digital literacy. In fact, what we see most students will use in terms of ICT in their life, and what will enable them to be fully participant in society, are around using online sources of information in a meaningful and good way. So I would say being able to plan and execute searches online, being able to evaluate the usefulness of information, to assess the credibility of sources, that's actually reading skills, but that are specifically important in an online environment. And that should be part of every student's repertoire of skills. On top of it, of course, it's more technical skills. I mean, one of the reasons for having ICT in schools is also to prepare some students, those who wish so, to work in ICT-related trades or occupations. And these are not skills that everybody needs in the future, but obviously they can give you an advantage in the labor market. We know that those students who are able to find technological solutions to everyday problems are those who are more successful in work, who are going to be more successful in work, because their own work will never be replaced or digitized in the future.
Okay, we have a question here also. What does this study show us? We find that, as Andreas presented, that just because you have a high-tech classroom doesn't mean that student performance has improved at all. Did this study make the connection why technology does not seem to be the answer as perhaps many of us thought it was going to be in the classroom? What is it, in your opinion, or what does the data show is the reason why technology introduced in the classroom does not seem to be the cure-all or the miracle that we all had expected it to be?
You know, the data that we have here are still very limited in sort of highlighting the kind of pedagogical strategies and the instructional techniques and learning environments that students face. But sort of the hunch that we clearly have is that just adding 21st century technology to 20th century teaching and maybe 19th century learning environments isn't giving superior learning outcomes. So we do not know to what extent the technology itself is a barrier. Again, you know, there are huge question marks about the quality of educational software in many countries. But the biggest barrier probably is the delivery in the classroom, sort of the intelligent use, the integration, the effective integration of technology into the pedagogical work environment of teachers and students. That's where probably most of the work will be needed to reach improvements.
Another participant asked us, does the OECD have any projects to continue studying this phenomenon, the fact that there's somewhat of a disconnect between technology in the classroom and student performance?
Absolutely. This is this will be a priority for us, and in fact, in a very few months from now, we're going to release a very interesting report on innovative learning environments, where we studied cases where the integration of technology, but more broadly, the design of effective and innovative learning environments has been very, very successful. We're still not there to link that in a quantitative sort of scientific way to learning outcomes. That's still a bit into the future, but we have been very, very interested in cases where the kind of challenges that we see here are successfully mastered. So watch out for that space. In a couple of months, you're going to see those findings. We are also, I should say, bringing together ministers and industry leaders in a summit in Helsinki very shortly to think about how countries can approach that question more strategically. What has happened in the past, or even now, is that sort of technology gets dumped into schools without a plan, without a strategy, schools being overwhelmed, and ministries of education often not having much of a strategy. So we want to work together between ministers and industry leaders on whether we can organize that space more intelligently.
Thank you. We have another question that just came through. Was the relationship between ICT use and the difference and socioeconomic variables, was that studied in this report? And if so, what was the relationship between that, and does that have an effect, socioeconomic status of students, does that have an effect on their digital reading skills?
Very interesting question, and you saw the data on the social disparities and technology access. Well, when it comes to use, it was our hope actually that technology would be a way, to deliver great teaching to students that are more difficult to reach and more disadvantaged backgrounds, that it would have to mobilize good learning environment. But actually, it was very sobering that we see exactly the same kind of disparities in digital skills that we see in the case of math, science, and reading. So probably, on balance, we'll be better off, helping students master those foundation skills than focusing on technology, at least today. At least today, technology doesn't seem to do a good job in bridging the social divide any better than we do in the traditional schooling.
Another participant raised an interesting question. We are here talking about or questioning whether it's wise to increase our investment in technology in the classroom. And this person made the point that if there's only one PC per student in the classroom, it actually makes his or her job much more difficult to teach. It's very time-consuming, or not so much time-consuming, but the teacher cannot devote enough time to all the students if they're all huddled over one sole PC. How do we square this circle?
Well, actually, what you could see in the data is that in most countries, in many countries, you have one PC per student. This is not about, you talk about a few countries where that is the case, but in most countries, we are pretty close to a one-to-one ratio of students to computers. I don't think that's the principal barrier anymore, the mere access to this. But I think what this question also highlights is you really need to bring teachers in on the design of those technology strategies, not just their delivery and implementation. Teachers have a lot of experience. They know what teaching means, who their students are, and it is very, very important that we give them a more prominent role in the development of strategies here.
Would you say that countries such as Sweden, where a lot of resources have been invested in ICT equipment, would you say that they have in fact chosen the wrong path at this point?
It's very hard to answer. In fact, technology is there to stay. Technological skills are absolutely crucial for student success. But in fact, the reality is that Sweden has been one of the most disappointing experiences in school policies and practices. Now, it's the country with the largest decline in the quality of learning outcomes. To what extent that has to do with technology, that is not something we can answer. But clearly, technology hasn't been the magic bullet in Sweden that some people had hoped it would be.
Francesco, you might be able to answer this. A couple of participants have asked why certain countries, one of them was, I think, Romania, was not involved, or there's no data for Romania. Could you speak to why countries appear on, some countries appear in the study and other countries do not?
So in general, the study is based on the PISA 2012 participants, but in particular, most of the findings make use of one of two optional components of this study, which were delivered. So one is the assessment which were delivered on computers, and in 2012, not all the countries had the capacity to deliver assessments on computers, and it was also requiring some more time on their part. So that's one reason for some countries not to take part in that study. And the other component is the ACT questionnaire, which again was distributed in some 40 countries out of the 65 that participated in PISA. So we make use of what we have, and we try to be as exhaustive and possible, but indeed some countries are missing sometimes just because they didn't collect the data.
Okay, thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you very much, Andreas. I'm afraid we're going to have to end it here. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for your information at our website, www.oec.org/edu, and we hope you will take a look at it there. You can also send further questions to EduContact, and we will try to answer any other questions you may have. Thank you very much for participating, and we look forward to speaking with you next time. Thank you very much.